Hello friends, Mehjabin here. Today we are going to focus on the character and personality of Louis XVI, who was the last king of France who had descended from the Bourbon Dynasty. He was married to Marie Antoinette and he was executed in 1793 for treason. In other words, he was put on the guillotine at the time of the French Revolution. Do understand that this tutorial is the first of a series of videos I am going to make on the French Revolution. Now, before we move deeper into this video, it's important to understand what the Bourbon family is all about. Louis XVI was a member of this family. So what is the Bourbon Dynasty about? The Bourbon Dynasty was a European royal line that ruled in France from 1589 to 1793. Louis XVI belonged to this family, and in 1793 when he was executed, this Bourbon dynasty of monarchs came to an end in France. However, it must be pointed out that members of this Bourbon dynasty also ruled other parts of Europe like Spain, Naples, and Sicily. In other words, the Bourbon family had a list of powerful leaders who, apart from France, ruled over Spain, Naples, and Sicily. Now let's look into the early life of Louis XVI because it definitely had its share of tragedies. Louis XVI was born in the Palace of Versailles in France on August 23, 1754. He became the King of France at a very young age. At the time of his ascending to the throne on the 10th of May 1774, he was only 20 years old. Before becoming the King of France, he was known as Louis Auguste. Now, Louis XVI became the King of France under a series of very tragic and unusual circumstances. His older brother, Louis de Bourgogne, was supposed to inherit the throne of France in the future. However, the boy lost his life when he was only 9 years old. 4 years later, in 1765, Louis XVI's father, Louis Dauphin of France, died of tuberculosis. In 1767, Louis XVI's mother also died of tuberculosis. In 1770, Louis Auguste married the Austrian Archduchess Marie Antoinette. She was the daughter of Maria Theresa and Holy Roman Emperor Francis I. On the 10th of May 1774, Louis Auguste became Louis XVI because his grandfather Louis XV had died. Louis XVI was not at all prepared for his new role as the King of France. He was a shy person with low on self-confidence. During his childhood, his parents had probably not focused much on his grooming because they had thought that Louis XVI's older brother, Louis de Bourgogne, would inherit the throne of France. However, this did not happen as the boy had died. Louis XVI had received his education from the noblemen in the French court. He studied subjects like religion, morality, and humanities. He fared very well in Latin, history, geography, and astronomy. He was fluent both in Italian and English. The health condition of Louis XVI was quite good, and he indulged in physical activities like hunting and wrestling. He was also fond of the work of locksmithing, and this remained as a hobby all through his life. Louis XVI became the King of France at a time when the country was undergoing very serious financial problems. Louis XVI inherited these financial problems from his grandfather Louis XV. Not only were the royal coffers depleted, but 20 years of poor harvest, drought, cattle disease, and super high prices of bread had sparked was very young at that time. He was only 20. He had neither the maturity nor the confidence to handle the difficulties that governing had brought. He had to face an enormous amount of fiscal debt, and these financial woes faced by his country hounded him all through his reign as a king. At that time, the people of France had grown tired of a despotic monarchy. Louis XVI was an absolute monarch. This implied that he had all power in his hands. No one was permitted to criticize the king's policies and decisions. Louis XVI also did not like politics. He was not passionate about matters related to administration. Instead, he liked to spend his time hunting or locksmithing. His distant, uncommunicative nature also irked the people of France, and resentment towards him grew. At the time when Louis XVI had ascended to the throne of France, the administration of France had become old and inefficient. There had been no reforms in many years. Each province of France had its own laws and its own system to collect taxes. This created a lot of confusion in the country. One of the biggest failures of Louis XVI was his indecisiveness, or he appeared to take decisions by consulting the wrong people. He failed to give support to reformers who wanted to improve France's system of government. Instead, he depended on the ill advice of some of the noblemen in his court. He also gained unpopularity because the people knew that Louis XVI depended on the advice of his wife Marie Antoinette, who was a spendthrift and lacked sensitivity towards the plight of the common people of France. Both king and queen lived in a splendid palace at Versailles near Paris, and they were out of touch with the hardships of the ordinary people. Though the country was in financial trouble, Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette lived in immense luxury. At that time, the situation in France was very critical. The people had had to battle with famine caused by frequent weather changes. Common people could not afford to buy bread. People from different parts of France went to Paris in search of work. Shortage of food and hunger caused deep resentment among the people. They formed a mob. This crowd of angry people were ready to get violent and rise in revolt. For centuries, the French kings had lived in great luxury. They had fought expensive wars. Moreover, the system of taxation in France was also inefficient. The wealthy people were not required to pay any tax. As a result, the government was not able to collect enough funds. The common people of France hoped that their king Louis XVI would ask the nobles and the clergy to pay tax. For this purpose, on the 5th of May 1789, the Estate General meeting was held. However, the meeting disappointed the people. They realized that their king was in no mood to introduce changes. On the 14th of July 1789, many members of the Third Estate attacked the Bastille, which was a state prison for political prisoners. The prison was hated by all because it represented the despotic power of the king. The people stormed the Bastille because they were angry with their king and wanted to reach the weapons that were believed to be stored there. In this attack, the commander of the prison was killed, and the 7 prisoners inside were all released. The storming of the Bastille started a series of events that eventually led to the overthrow of King Louis XVI. The success of the revolutionaries who had stormed the Bastille gave the common people of France the courage to rise up and fight against the nobility who had ruled over them for so long. In this way, the French Revolution started. Louis XVI refused to accept the new changes that were made by the National Assembly. The feudal system was abolished. The nobility and clergy were deprived of the privileges they had enjoyed. A new constitution was formed and the powers of the king were limited. The King of France opposed all these reforms. So, a group of women and men dressed as women marched to the palace of Versailles. They broke into his palace in Versailles and forced him to return to Paris with them. A major result of the French Revolution was the execution of Louis XVI. The beheading of the king happened because he was convicted of treason. In the year 1791, on the 20th of June, Louis XVI, his wife Marie Antoinette, and their children tried to break free from their status of imprisonment in the Tuileries Palace in Paris. They disguised as servants and took a carriage through the French countryside. Their goal was to cross the French border and reach Austria. An official working for the revolutionaries stopped the carriage when it arrived in the small French town of Varennes. The royal family was recognized. Louis XVI and his family were forced to return to Paris. The king was now regarded as a traitor to the French Revolution. Louis XVI's attempt to run away from his own country was the deciding factor which led to his execution. He was beheaded by guillotine on the 21st of January 1793. With his death, the French monarchy, which had lasted for over 1,000 years, came to an end. On the 16th of October of the same year, that is 9 months after the death of her husband, Marie Antoinette was also convicted of treason and put to the guillotine. That's all for today. Thanks for sticking around. Meet you again very soon. Bye.